Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be taking a look at the Siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1944 by Simple History. As always, I will include a link to Simple History down in the description below. Please consider heading over to this original video or any other video they do and show them some love and appreciation and some support if you like what you see here. We always want to encourage our original content creators to keep making content like this for the rest of us to learn from and to enjoy. Alright, this is a fairly short video, only about 6.5 minutes long. However, I expect I'll be adding quite a bit to this one. This falls into one of my primary areas of interest in history, which is famine. I've said this in other videos, but famine, disease, and natural disasters of all types are one of the areas I get the most passionate and interested in when I'm looking at history. Also mass migrations, which are also often associated with these kind of things. So I've done a lot of reading on the Siege of Leningrad, especially first-hand accounts from survivors. Blokadniki is what they typically called in Russia, especially in Leningrad itself, now St. Petersburg. The Blokadniki, or the survivors, but also some of the people who didn't survive, who left diaries or letters but didn't make it through famine. So I will be adding a lot to this. I have actually got some diary entries from two different young ladies that I will share as we go through this, either at points where it feels like it's appropriate to me or at the very end, depending on how this plays out. I haven't seen it yet, so I don't know quite what to expect, but I will include some of this stuff. One of the diaries is from Tanya Savicheva. She is only, I believe, 11 years old when the siege begins, and her diary is only 8 pages long, and each page has only 1 or 2 sentences on it. A very short diary, but I'm going to include the entire thing. Now, why would I include her diary? I'm going to include her diary for the human element, because it, more than anything I think anybody can read for this particular siege, really etches the horror of what's going on here. It is fairly famous. There's even a monument to it right outside Leningrad, where they actually have, it's called the Flowers of Life monument. They actually have a series of basically stone monuments, each one containing one of the pages of her diary. Her diary was, according to several witnesses, first-hand accounts, used in the Nuremberg trials to put a human face on the people of Leningrad. So I will share that entire thing. I'm going to warn you, it is heartbreaking. That's all I got to say about it. The other diary we're going to be looking at is the diary of Lena Mukina. She was 16 when she started her diary. I believe she was 17 by the time the invasion started, but get the idea of roughly what age she was anyway. She survived. Actually, they both survived the siege, although unfortunately Tanya doesn't live long after it. She died of tuberculosis like a year later, almost certainly caused by the malnutrition and stress and strain of living through these conditions. Mukina died sometime in the 1990s. She had a long life after this. But one thing I like about Lena Mukina's diary is she is a typical teenage girl. So she's writing about everyday life in Leningrad right before the siege, and then during the siege, she describes what's going on around her and how it's affecting her and her family. And it really gives us an interesting perspective because, unlike a lot of the other diaries I've read, which tend to be either from older people who are more analytical in many cases, or younger people like Tanya, hers is more like you'd expect a diary to be. It's more approachable. It's got a lot of emotion in it, and it kind of helps get you an idea of what life would like for the average person here, not for the academics or the elites who are typically the ones we get some of these accounts from. So I find hers to be a really good one. Also, her writing's really bring home some of the psychological effects of famine. I talked about this in a previous video. There was an experiment done in, I believe it was 1945 or maybe 44, in preparation for bringing home prisoners of war and things like that, where they tested the effects of prolonged starvation on healthy young men, military-age men. And they listed the psychological repercussions. And they make a list of the traits typically associated with prolonged starvation. And Lena Mukina checks them off just like, I mean, she could have been in that study. It is just, they list like 4 or 5 characteristics, and she ticks them all off in her diary. So I find that fascinating. Tragic, don't get me wrong, but fascinating. Anyway, I will share some of her observations, in particular, how they survived. And again, it's not necessarily for the faint of heart. Some of the things she says are disturbing. Some of the things she says are, depending on the type of person you are, kind of horrifying. But you got to put yourself in the shoes of these people and understand what they were going through. So anyway, I will share that as we go. If I see a spot that's appropriate, if not, we'll just go through it at the end. Anyway, I've rambled enough here at the beginning. Let's see what Simple History has for us.
September 8th, 1941 through January 27th, 1944. Siege length, 872 days. World War II.
It's often called the 900 days, but yeah, it's only actually 872. Not that I think it makes much difference when you're living through it. It probably felt more like forever.
Leningrad was one of the main objectives of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It was here that the main base of the Soviet Baltic Fleet was, as well as...
Yeah, Kronstadt Island. It's right out in the Bay of Finland. You've got right off the mainland, you've got the fortress of Peter and Paul. And then further out, you have Kronstadt, which is where the bulk of the naval forces are.
...was important industry that was churning out weapons. The conquest of Leningrad was not just an operational request of the German HQ. Hitler also saw the symbolic significance of the city of Leningrad. Conquering the city would have been a massive blow in morale for the Soviets, who were already weakened by the huge German success on the front. Furthermore, Hitler wanted the city razed to the ground, its population killed or driven further east as part of his Generalplan Ost. However, Joseph Stalin...
That's something I don't think it's emphasized enough. Hitler had a list of people he wanted wiped out or driven into permanent exile. It included the Jews. It also included gypsies and other minority groups, including communists and Slavs. So, Generalplan Ost, he actually issued an order. We're not here to capture Leningrad. I mean, we want the city. We don't want the people. Wipe them out, exterminate them, or push them all the way out into Siberia. But we're not here to take prisoners. I want them wiped out. I want them gone. Whatever it takes, make them gone.
Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, also realized the importance of Leningrad, both strategic and symbolically, and stated that it could not fall into German hands.
His advisors did not agree with him on that, largely. They wanted to pull out of Leningrad and focus more on protecting Moscow. But Stalin was stubborn. He wanted Leningrad held at all costs, and I think this is a fair point. He understood not only the strategic value, it does have access to the Baltic, does have the Baltic Fleet. It also has some major factories, including military factories, and there's that symbolic element. That was the capital from the time of Peter the Great up until the Revolution. It's where the revolution began, and it's named after Lenin. It's going to be a huge morale blow if that gets lost.
Conquest of Leningrad was the objective of Army Group North, under command of Field Marshal von Lieb. It consisted of the 18th Army, led by Field Marshal Georg von Kugler, the 4th Panzer Group, and the 16th Army. At the beginning, the Germans had no difficulty in fighting against the Soviet armies at the Northwestern Front. By July 10th, Kugler managed to push the Soviet troops out of the Baltic states, forcing them into defensive operations to save Leningrad from being surrounded. The Soviets, meanwhile, never managed to halt the German attacks and were constantly forced to retreat to new defensive positions. While the German 18th Army was marching towards Leningrad, The 4th Panzer Group was making important progress towards Luga and Novgorod, and then moved further towards Lake Ladoga in order to cut off Leningrad from the rest of the country.
Right.
On August 30th, the Germans reached.
So if you're not familiar with the geography, and I'll pull up a map later, maybe if they don't, you have the Bay of Finland, you have up a little bit to the northeast, you have a gigantic lake, Lake Ladoga, and there's just a narrow area between them, and St. Petersburg is right there at the end of the Bay of Finland, not far from the southwestern corner of Ladoga. It's on the Neva River. Sometimes I hear it pronounced Neva or Neva. I think it actually should be Neva, but I'm not sure on that one. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The big thing is if they can get up and capture up to Lake Ladoga, they pretty much cut the city off, because it's not far north of Leningrad is Finland, which is also allied with the Germans. So if they can capture up to Ladoga, they pretty much cut off Leningrad completely.
The Neva River, which allowed them to start bombing Leningrad. The first bombs dropped on Leningrad on September 4th, 1941. On September 8th, 1941, the German forces managed to reach the shores of Lake Ladoga, which meant that the city was cut off by land. The siege would begin. From the north, Leningrad was attacked by the Finns, Germany's ally. Their offensive eventually proved to be a huge problem for the Germans, as the Finns were satisfied with just reclaiming the territories lost in the 1939 Winter War and not pushing further onto the city itself.
Okay, so we got a map here. So got Finland up here. They are part of the siege. However, he made a point, but I can't drive this home enough. The Finns were allied with the Germans, but they were not all in on this plan to wipe out Leningrad. They wanted the land they lost during the Winter War back, and once they reached those former borders, they stopped. And despite pressure from the Germans, the Finns refused to force their way into the city. They wanted nothing to do with that. They just wanted their old territory back. And had they done what the Germans wanted, it's a lot more likely that Leningrad would have fallen. So Leningrad, to some degree, probably almost certainly owes their survival to the Finns basically just saying, hey, we're not here to murder civilians. We got what we wanted. We wanted our land back. If you want to murder those civilians, you need to do it yourself. We're not going to take part in that. And I'm paraphrasing here, but you get the idea. They reached their former borders and stopped. They were going to prevent the Soviets from coming in from the north to help. Yes, but they weren't going to take any new territory or to help wipe out the city. They drew the line there. Anyway, here you can see Lake Ladoga. You can see Leningrad. This is the Bay of Finland. This is Kronstadt, where the naval base is. So Leningrad's right here. So you see that just a narrow strip of land, and the border of Finland's not far away. So if the Germans can capture up here to Ladoga and Bay of Finland, at that point, they pretty much got Leningrad cut off, and they're in big trouble. It's a pretty easy city to cut off. This is one reason why a lot of times in Russian history, they try to get that land from Finland, is they wanted a buffer zone to make it a little safer for Leningrad there.
This would prevent a complete encirclement around the city. Under Hitler's orders, effective on September 15th, von Lieb lost the 4th Panzer Group, which was to be transferred to Army Group Center for the upcoming Moscow offensive. This would provide some relief for the Soviet defenders, but the German artillery bombardment would ensure the siege would still continue as heavily as before. As a consequence of allowing the Germans to surround Leningrad, the Soviet commander of the Northwestern Front, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, was replaced with the more capable General Georgy Zhukov, who quickly organized the defense of Leningrad. The whole civilian population of Leningrad was organized into building defensive positions.
Yeah, that is true. In fact, let me read a diary entry from Lena Mukina, because she actually straight up talked about that. On July 1st, 1941, she writes, across the city, the construction of air raid shelters, ditches, and trenches is nearing completion. Decrees have been issued introducing compulsory labor duty. She was only 16 or 17 at this time. She and a lot of other civilians were drafted into the military to build these fortifications, ditches, air raid shelters, anything and everything they could. Even Tanya, who was only 11, was involved in this type of construction. It was all hands on deck. This was literally a matter of survival. If the Germans got in, they had orders to eliminate everybody. So, of course, everybody is going to be involved in it in some capacity. Doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter. You're getting drafted.
Leningrad was completely surrounded with defensive fortifications. Wooden obstacles, barbed wire, anti-tank trenches, and ordinary trenches were all built. Anti-aircraft guns, the Baltic Fleet, and tanks, some of which had been produced in factories during the siege, added to the defense. After a month of constant artillery preparation and bombardment, the Germans were eventually ordered not to mount a full-scale assault on the city, as it was believed it would cost them too many soldiers. Hitler's directive from October 7, 1941, ordered the German forces to hold the city under siege, therefore starving the Soviet defenders to death. However, the Germans didn't expect such a heroic resistance by the Leningrad defenders. The siege would last for 872 days, during which citizens were severely lacking food, water, energy, heating, and medicine. By the beginning of winter, Leningrad had lost around 50,000 lives. The arrival of winter did have one benefit. It caused Lake Ladoga to become frozen, which allowed the Soviets to establish a corridor over it to get much-needed supplies into the city. This ice corridor was remembered as the Road of Life, and it served not only to bring supplies to the city when other supply lines were being cut off, but also a way to evacuate civilians to safety.
Yeah, that was Doroga Жизни, the Road of Life. That began with sleds early in the winter. Then they started using trucks. Then they actually escalated. They actually built a railroad track across the frozen lake and ran rail line trains in and out of Leningrad. They'd bring in food, take out civilians. Bring in food, take out civilians. And of course, you can see here, it was deadly. The Germans were the Luftwaffe was constantly going over the lake. The artillery was constantly firing on them. So really amazing what they pulled off here, though. But before this, they did have boats going over the lake as well. The boats were not nearly as efficient, however. And, well, give me a moment. I'm going to pull up a map of my own. I'll be right back. All right, so this is a map of the Siege of Leningrad. So what we're looking at here is some of the ways that they got help in. So right over in this area, there was a rural rail line that ran right up to the lake. And by rural, I mean it was very, very simple rail line. It did not have water towers or coal depots or anything like that. So the engineers taking that route in had to actually stop, cut down timber, collect timber to use to power the engine and collect their own water by hand. So it was a very difficult endeavor, but it was really the only effective way they had to get supplies in here. There had been major rail lines, but unfortunately, early in the war, like here, I think it was Magah, had a major rail line. That got cut off. There were some others over in here. There was a lot of pushing back and forth between the Germans and the Soviets, but the Soviets were able to bring supplies in by rail to a certain point. Then they had to transfer to a very rural rail line that was very difficult to use. They came over here to Novaya Ladoga, and they would send boats up and over here. Many of the boats were sunk due to Luftwaffe and artillery. And of course, the boats that did survive would try to come back with civilians. Several of those were sunk with women and children aboard. Really tragic stuff. But they were trying hard. When the winter comes, the ice freezes. They're able to, as you can see down here, by that time they recapture Kabona, and they're able to build a rail line. First sleds, like I said, then trucks, and actually a rail line across here. But Germans are holding this territory, so they've got access to do some serious threat, make serious threat to this. So it was a very dangerous endeavor, but it saved tens of thousands of lives at least, but if not hundreds of thousands. Let's get back to the main video. All right, we're back. I'm going to rewind this just a bit so we can get context.
Other supply lines were being cut off, but also a way to evacuate civilians to safety. The road was, however, a constant target of the German Luftwaffe, so transport of goods and people was a dangerous venture. Nevertheless, a great famine remained present during the entire siege, and it was the reason for the majority of the casualties. At some point, citizens were allowed a daily portion of only 125 grams of bread made of flour and sawdust. On some days, not even that.
Yeah, so that's partially true, but it's a little more nuanced than that, a little more complicated. So let's talk about the rationing real quick. So at the very beginning of the siege, they kind of had a tiering system. Okay, so your factory workers or your soldiers or your critically important men typically would be getting around 800 grams of bread a day. That was their ration, 800 grams of bread. That's a little over a typical loaf that you'd pick up at the supermarket today. Somewhere around 2,100 calories, give or take. So it's not a terrible ration, but that's just for the essential factory workers, soldiers, the really critical people. The state workers, state employees, for example, were getting around 600 grams. So it's already going down. The average civilian would have been getting typically half of what the factory workers got. So if the factory workers were at 800, typically the civilian would get about 400. That's half a loaf of bread a day. That's just a little over 1,000 calories. That is the starvation level distance already. So you already get an idea. This is the beginning. Now, when you get closer to, the further you go into that first winter, the lower those rations get. So it starts at 800, then it goes to 600 for the factory workers, and they're down to like 400. And then by time late November rolls around, like November 28th or so, I think was one of the days that they changed the rationing. It went down to, I think the lowest point was like 300 grams. Might even have gone briefly as low as 250. But yeah, I think it did go as low. I know it did. It went as low as 250 grams a day for the most essential people. The civilians were only getting about 125 grams of bread a day. About 5 slices, give or take. Or no, about 4 slices. The average slice of bread is somewhere right around a little over 20 grams. So that should give you an idea of what these people were trying to live on. Now, we got to add a little bit more to that, though, because bread wasn't the only food that they got, typically, on a good day. So if you were working an essential job, you would typically be provided a lunch. That lunch would probably be some version of a broth or a gruel. It would probably what we might call an eternal soup or an eternal stew. They just keep a pot boiling and add whatever they've got to it, and you would just kind of scoop out a spoonful. Those rations were very minimal, but you at least got a little bit that way. It probably would have been less than you got in the bread, but you did get that. When things were going a little better, you might get an additional ration of, say, sugar. Occasionally, they would get bonus supplies in. For example, and I don't have an example of it here with my diary entries, but Lenin Mukina specifically mentioned one incident where they got a shipment of American chocolates in, and they were just so excited about that. And believe me, they were praising the Americans and the British, or she was anyway, and she expressed that they were all so grateful for that. So we're talking about the rations, and when you hear things like, oh, they only got a couple of slices of bread a day, that's true at the low point, but again, your job and your ranking in terms of priority made a difference. So some people that were considered essential workers got more than the average civilians. State workers were typically right in between the two, although at the low points they were same as the civilians. Like I said, at the lowest point, November through December, the very first year, civilians and their state workers were getting around 120 grams a day. That's 5 slices of bread a day to live on, which is just horrifying when you think about it. They had water supply problems, especially when winter came in and things started freezing. They did not have the power or energy to heat. and it was an unusually cold winter. The water lines actually froze up in some places. They had to dig into the streets and crack open the water lines in a few instances. Totally horrifying experience. And for on the topic of food, I want to read a couple of things that Lena Mukina wrote about food. It'll give you a lot of insights into what this level of starvation subsistence will push people to do. So, 8 September 1941. Oh, wait. This is earlier, but this has got to do with the food supply as well. But let me share this one. On September 8th, 1941, he writes, yesterday, they, meaning the Germans, managed to burn down the Badiev food storage warehouses. Yesterday, the ground literally shook beneath our feet. Okay, the Badiev food warehouses was where almost all of Leningrad food had been moved for safe storage. That day, they lost around 3,000 tons of flour and about 2,500 tons of sugar. So at that point, that kind of marked a turning point where they really seriously descend into famine. And that's also the point where the rationing goes from reasonable, a loaf of bread a day for the essential workers, down to about a half a bread a day for the civilians, to meager rations. 18 December 1941. This is something that it breaks my heart to think about this, but because I'm an animal lover, I've got one dog and 2 cats here. My wife, who is studying in another city right now for her master's degree, has 2 cats over there with her. Today we had some tasty soup with meat and macaroni. There's enough cat meat for 2 more meals. It would be good to find another cat somewhere. Then we would have enough to last us a long time. I never thought cat meat would be so tender and so tasty. Yeah, they were desperate enough they were going out and hunting down animals. In this case, a cat, but animals, pets in general in the city disappeared. By the end of December, they were just basically gone. So this gives you an idea, and this is really early on in the siege. It's only been going on for a few months, but people are already getting desperate. Winter's here. There's no heat. There's no water. There is, but it's hard to get at. Everybody is working around the clock to build defensive works. Got to imagine what this had to be like. 28th of December, so 10 days later. He's talking about a woman named Akka. No one is 100% sure who Akka is, at least from what I read anyway. But it's believed to be a grandmother, or at least a grandmother-like figure, who lived with Lena Mukina and her wife. Her mother. Excuse me. If Akka died, it would be for the best. Mama and I could divide everything in half rather than into 3 portions. I don't know how I can even bring myself to write such things. But if she's going to die, I hope it happens after the first. So we'll be able to get her ration card. Okay? So this is somebody that we know from earlier entries she truly loves. But at this point, she just wants this person to die so they can get her ration card and get more food. Or first of all, they don't have to split it as much, but if she just holds on a few more days, then she'll get her ration card, and then she can die, and we can use her ration card for the rest of the month. This is the mindset this puts us in, and this is not at all atypical of famine situations like this. The Minnesota starvation experiment I mentioned earlier, one of the things that they observed in these young men they were testing was apathy, where they just ceased to care about anything or anybody. Pets, food, friends, loved ones, the food's more important. This is the kind of effect this level of starvation can put on people. And like I said, this is hardly the only entry like this that I've seen in diaries. You see a lot of examples of where families are kind of turning on each other, not necessarily violently, but it becomes every man, woman, child for him or herself. In some cases, some of these entries can get very disturbing. Now, she kind of, when we're mentioning that, I hope she dies after the first so we can get her ration card. Ration card fraud was a big deal early on in famine. So much so that the local Soviet leaders had to crack down on it hard. For example, People were trying to forge cards. They were doing things like what Lena is talking here, hoping people would die so they could have that person's card to get more food. So they did things like you cannot get a replacement card. So if your card gets lost or damaged or stolen, tough luck. We're not going to replace it. For the rest of the month until the next time we distribute cards come along, you're on your own. It got pretty bad. All right, I'm going to read one more from Lenin Mukina. This is the 10th of January, 1942. This will give you another idea of some of the things they do to survive. The jelly is quite harmless. On the contrary, it's very nutritious. Good quality carpenter's glue is made from hooves and horns of various animals. By using this method, Mama and I will have a ready supply of extra food without using any coupons. Rations. So what she was doing was stealing wallpaper and scraping off and melting off all the glue on the back of the wallpaper and using that to make meat jellies as food. And this was not uncommon. We know that they were boiling leather from shoes, from furniture, from clothing. Any kind of glue could be used. People were living on that. It's just boggles the mind what these people had to do to find food and how desperate they were getting. There are also examples of like these bread rations. When I said that an average loaf of bread, you're looking at like 2,100 calories, give or take, depending on the type of bread, etc., etc. That initial ration of 800 grams would be about 2,100 calories. That's if it's full bread. But a lot of the bread, especially going into the first winter, was cut with sawdust to bulk it up, but not give it any nutritional value. They did that because they just didn't have enough ingredients to meet this quota. So when you see somebody say that they got 125 grams of bread, and you say, well, that should be X amount of calories. No, probably not. There's a good chance that a good chunk of that bread is just sawdust. So, again, I think this helps us put into perspective what these people were going through. Also, they said earlier that they were quoting casualties like 20,000 right away in just the first few months of starvation, died of starvation. That's not, well, it's indirectly correct. So dying of starvation is actually extremely rare. It happens. It can happen. More often than not, though, starvation deaths are actually disease. Because what happens is when you get starvation, you get malnutrition, and you become wide open to any and every disease out there. So most famine deaths that you'll hear described, they died of starvation, they died of famine. A vast majority of the time, it's disease that comes in and kills you because you're so weakened. Your resistance is gone. And especially in the winter, it's cold, it's freezing, there's no heat. You don't have fuel for fire or anything. And they did at first because they were tearing up their furniture and walls in some cases. But that only goes so far too. So when they say starvation, what they're really talking about almost all the time, but it's a fine distinction. So, but I just want to make that clear. In fact, the other diarist, which we'll get to in a little bit, Tanya Savicheva was he died shortly after getting out of Leningrad to tuberculosis, and again, almost certainly because of malnutrition. Generally weakened condition opened her up to diseases that killed her.
Despite all the atrocities, the city authorities were persistent in keeping morale as high as possible. The stalemate of the siege was occasionally interrupted by several Soviet attempts to break it. The first one was in late summer 1942, when Soviet troops from the east started an offensive in order to connect with the Leningrad defenders. At the same time, the Germans were preparing an offensive to capture the city without awareness of the Soviet plans. When the Soviets attacked, the German forces had to abandon their plans, but managed to repel the enemy away from the city. The next attempt to break the siege was more successful. On January 12, 1943, the Red Army commenced a full-scale offensive on the German positions on the south bank of Lake Ladoga. After a week of heavy fighting, the Soviets managed to destroy the German positions and to establish a land route with Leningrad, allowing more supplies into the city. A year later, in January 1944, when it became obvious that German ambitions in the Soviet Union were doomed, Red Army units started a new offensive that resulted in a complete lift of the siege. During the 872 days of the siege from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, more than 1 million of the Leningrad defenders and citizens lost their lives. Most of the deaths were due to Great Famine, but shelling and air bombing took their toll as well.
There were reported incidents of cannibalism, in case you were wondering. I believe there was around 2,000 arrests for cannibalism during the Siege of Leningrad. There's always been debate over stories of cannibalism during famines. We know it happens. There are definitely documented examples, but there's also a lot of anecdotal examples as well where we just don't know for sure. But there were at least 2,000 arrests that I'm aware of in Leningrad during this period for cannibalism. That's how bad it got. So, horrifying experience. That looks like that's at the end. Well, nope. A little bit more, maybe? Okay, nope, that's it. Just a closing screen. All right. For closing this out, I want to read you the entire diary of Tanya Savich. This is her entire diary. She was 11 years old. She wrote, basically, with one exception, one sentence per page. So, Xenia died on December 28th at 12 noon, 1941. That's her older sister. Grandmother died on the 25th of January at 3 o'clock, 1942. Yeka died March 17th at 5 o'clock in the morning, 1942. I believe that's another sibling. Uncle Vasya died on April 13th at 2 o'clock in the morning, 1942. Uncle Lesha May, aunt, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 1942. On May 13th. At 7:30 in the morning, 1942. Those are the first 6 pages of her diary. The 7th page, her family, her name, Savicheva, is the Savichev family. At the end, it's because she's a girl. The 7th page is Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. The final page, the 8th page, only Tanya is left. That's all she could write in her diary. Just a list of one family member after another dying, until only she, the youngest, is left. I think that, more than anything else, put the human face on this. This simple little diary of this little girl tells everything we need to know about what life in Leningrad was like during this. Because I guarantee pretty much every family in there, if they had wanted to write a diary like this, they could have. Horrifying. But this diary, there is a monument. The diary itself was introduced in the Nuremberg trials, I'm sure, to humanize what happened here. You say, hey, look at what this life was like in this city during this time. So, and yeah, Tanya herself dies shortly after. She gets removed from Leningrad right near the end of the whole thing, but she dies not long after tuberculosis, almost certainly as a result of this siege. So even she is a casualty of it. She just lasts a little bit longer. So that's the Siege of Leningrad for you. I don't want to say I hope you enjoyed this, because there's nothing to enjoy in situations like this. And famines are just tragic. They are windows into some of the best aspects of human nature, how people can come together, how they can work together to survive. It's also a good example of perseverance, how individuals can do what lengths they'll go to survive. But it's also a window into some of our darkest sides. Again, the lengths that we'll go through to survive. Whether it's reducing ourselves to hunting, eating our own pets, or our neighbors, or even family members. Horrifying stuff. So, anyway, that's the Siege of Leningrad. I don't know what else to say other than thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll come back for my next video. Till then, до свидания.